District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. There's a lot of energy news surrounding the reopening, and closure. It seems like an endless cycle of the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East. On Friday, when the stock market closed, we saw that crude oil futures went below $84 a barrel. Natural gas prices here and abroad are starting to decrease. And we will hopefully start to see energy prices, especially gasoline prices, trickle down. And as we await these details, I think it's important to talk about other subjects you might have missed and for me to put a couple things on your radar. I'm going to have 2 shorter episodes this week, today and tomorrow, for your awareness. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on previewing my talk with Daily Caller Live tomorrow morning in Washington, D.C. You can catch a broadcast if you're not in the area or in attendance, where I'll be talking about energy and manufacturing. And then I will go into Maine soon becoming the 25th state to pass or strengthen a right to hunt and fish amendment. Let's start with my event tomorrow, just for your awareness with Daily Caller Live. This was a last-minute edition. And the theme of tomorrow's talk is American Innovation and Manufacturing Renaissance. So it's going to be early morning in DC. I'm not sure if they're at capacity, but if you're listening and wanting to attend, there is a link to register. But I highly recommend, since it is kind of early, you can watch the live stream if you're curious. There are going to be 2 panels, one on permitting, regulation, and industrial capacity, and 2, which I believe I'm speaking on, supply chains, energy inputs, and U.S. competitiveness. I am going to be speaking on the panel alongside Emily de la Bruyere, co-founder of Horizon Advisory, and I believe she's involved with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies as well, alongside Congresswoman Beth Van Doon of Texas. So that is going to be a very exciting panel, and I have talked at length and written for IWF and a little bit here on the podcast about reshoring, manufacturing, enhancing more trade relationships and the like, and how those are not at odds with each other as it's underpinned by energy abundance, because we are too dependent, for example, on China for rare earth elements. We import, I believe, 70%. And we used to be the second largest exporter of rare earth elements, which are subsets of critical minerals, in the 90s, until that shifted and much of that went to China, unfortunately. So the gist of the talk is this: America is entering a new industrial moment as global competition intensifies and supply chains realign. The U.S. faces a clear mandate: build, innovate, and lead. American Innovation and Manufacturing Renaissance brings together policymakers, industry leaders, and innovators to examine how the U.S. can reclaim industrial strength, scale advanced manufacturing, and secure its economic future. Modern industrial policy, technological leadership, workforce development, and the regulatory environment needed to accelerate growth. And I am a free market person, and I don't think reshoring and bringing back certain things is necessarily at odds with that. I know there are some people who take issue with that. I don't believe in wholesale industrial policy like common good conservatives or NatCons that involves a lot of government input. There are some cases where if it's a national security interest, there might be perhaps some justification for government taking stake in companies, but I tend to be skeptical of that, and I don't need to talk about that in particular. But I think there is a vested interest among people who are free marketeers, industrialists, or practitioners, of industrial policy, who want to see some bringing back of these industries, particularly manufacturing, energy, especially refining. The reason why gas prices haven't gone down totally in the United States is a lot of our refining capacity is from imported crude, and we haven't had new refineries open in several decades, and there is one, I believe, in Texas or Louisiana that is slated to be approved and open in the next few years. So we're bringing back even refining capacity with respect to oil and gas. The American Chemistry Council is co-hosting this event, and I hope to relay some clips and analysis, post-event analysis for you all next week when the event is completed. But I want to put that on your radar. You're going to see some postings from me on social media and perhaps on the podcast page as well of this event. which I'm doing on behalf of Independent Women's Forum and our Center for Energy and Conservation. I also forgot it's also Earth Week. So much has been happening, and you can almost miss Earth Week. It's the 22nd. Since it's midweek, I don't really have any adventures slated for outdoor activities this upcoming weekend, except at an event that I will be going to and will share more about in tomorrow's episode. But I can take some outdoorsy pics and rehash those on social media just to keep up with what's going on. But funny enough, it is timed during Earth Day, and I think the takeaway, which also blends into our discussion of Maine becoming the 25th state to adopt a right to hunt and fish amendment, which I'll go into more momentarily, is that you can have productivity, you can have projects, you can have drilling, you can have nuclear, you can have all these different manufacturing activities occur without despoiling the environment. We are now in a post-preservation, post-rewilding time. The thinking of Paul Ehrlich, who just passed away not too long ago, earlier this year, a month ago, give or take. I think around my birthday, he actually passed, leading up to mid-March. This Malthusian doomerism, calling for population control as a environmental philosophy, is going extinct the way of the dodo bird, and we can celebrate that. And a true conservationist alternative without this twisting and contorting of what conservation is, the wise use of natural resources, is now starting to become more prominent. We've argued this here on the podcast for the last 9 years that I've been broadcasting on this format, and I appreciate each and every one of you who has stuck from the beginning, and even those of you who are new adopters to the show. Hope you're enjoying the content as well. But that leads me to this really positive news out of Maine. A little context before I go into certain statements and what groups have said about this, but there was previously in Maine, before they adopted the statutory right to hunt, there was a right to food statute passed in 2021, public law number 642, which allows the constitutional protection of right to food, defining and establishing hunting, fishing, and trapping as a means for food procurement in statute. Last year, in the form of LD 280, lawmakers in Maine passed the constitutional amendment to put on the ballot, from my understanding, the right to hunt, fish, and harvest by traditional methods. CSF notes that although LD 820 failed to move forward, in part due to arguments raised because of a pre-existing right to food amendment which was added to the Maine Constitution in 2021, the right to hunt was already protected and an additional amendment was not needed. While potentially true, though not yet tested in the courts, the right to food amendment did not specifically account for trapping and fishing as a means of harvesting food. Then they note that LD 1343, which updated the definition of harvest in statute to include trapping and fishing, and supplementing the 2021 amendment by codifying in statute citizens' right to hunt, fish, and trap. Now to a statement from International Order of T. Roosevelt CEO Luke Hilgeman, friend of the show, and he offered this statement in response to Maine passing a statutory right to hunt and fish amendment, making it the 25th state in the U.S. Half of the U.S. will now have this. He says it's a good step forward, but not as powerful as having the backing of the people through the Constitution, so having been brought to a vote by the voters of Maine during this year's midterm elections. And he says IOTR official is working on that too. My quote, Governor Mills signing the statutory right to hunt and fish into law is a meaningful step in the right direction for Maine sportsmen and sportswomen, but we won't stop there. Through our ongoing court challenge, the International Order of T. Roosevelt is confident that Maine will soon become the next state to forever enshrine this fundamental right in its constitution, permanently protecting the tremendous economic value and deep conservation traditions that hunting and fishing have supported for generations. So it's not quite over in this saga to make this permanent. I trust IOTR and CSF. They're probably the best groups out there that are fighting for these very important constitutional right to hunt and fish amendments. And we talk about this all the time. Some hunters and anglers are communicating, why do we need this? Why are these protections essential? If you look at the states, you look at Colorado, California, Oregon in particular, IP28, to potentially ban hunting, fishing, farming, ranching. Goodness, that is scary. But hopefully the likelihood of that being adopted as a ballot initiative does not come to fruition, but the proponents are very animated and serious about getting it on the ballot. So that leaves me worried for friends back in Oregon. Your state legislature can flip politically. And I hate to make it a red and blue issue, but with how polarized we are as a country now, with few exceptions, you do see attacks on hunting and fishing for the most part in blue states. You do see some efforts to defund hunting and fishing coming even from the right sometimes to remove certain monies that are deemed wasteful spending, which I think is silly. I think Tennessee and Indiana were grappling with this recently, but I do see more of the attacks coming from the left in blue states, but sometimes Republicans in red states can do a lot of misfiring on this as well, and we expose that when appropriate and problematic. But who you have leading your governor's mansion, your state legislature, is extremely important. This legislative cycle under the supermajority of Democrats in Virginia, I haven't seen anything. I don't recall any coyote contests being banned, but I suspect this was like a trial run. They have a couple more years unless we change the makeup in Virginia. And people are not very happy here on a whole host of issues, especially with the gun control legislation I talked about with Stephen Gutowski last week. If the General Assembly tries to tinker with hunting and fishing laws next year, we will be spotlighting that. My worry is that if there are no checks and balances, they will go full steam ahead like they did with gun control to severely limit what type of hunting methods we can do. And I believe some of these gun control measures also apply to hunting guns that we can use for big game hunting as well, although most people don't use ARs. You can have a Virginia compliant AR. I do. I just don't use it. It's too bulky and heavy. I realize that. I believe I will use a bolt action rifle for any big game hunting that I continue to do in Virginia going forward. It's a good recreational shooting gun and for home protection. New Hampshire was supposed to be the 25th state to do it, but something happened there. Even though they have a pretty pro-sportsman supermajority, it did not clear the legislature when we had Fred Bird from CSF to come and talk about this. So even in red states, they can't pass this, which is unfortunate. I don't think the lawmakers there fully understand what's at stake with this, or perhaps they wanted some sort of buy-in or favors or some other gimmicks, because that's what politicians do. They wheel and deal until they can get something satisfactory to put their support behind this. So it didn't even clear committee, if I recall correctly from our conversation with Fred. So I was looking forward to New Hampshire being the 25th state. This might be somewhat positive, and we'll have Luke and some others from IOTR in the future once there's more movement on this. But this does seem to be a good first step, but I tend to agree that it should have been passed, then brought to a vote to the ballot box so the people of Maine can decide what they want and hopefully in favor of this. But you see the attacks on hunting and fishing that are percolating across the country, particularly in blue states. We do see more people leaving these activities, unfortunately, as they age out, which is a perennial problem that the industry has talked about at length for many, many years. We've had many guests talk about this. And if you can't sustain a population of active participants in these sports, people will drop off. You see less monies, you see less licenses, and then you see the antis try to claim victory and say, okay, we have to find other ways to do this. We have to divorce ourselves from Pittman Robertson, Dingle Johnson, which would be a very worrisome future. Fishing, not so much, but hunting and shooting sports could be on the line. So that is why amendments like this are extremely critical for protecting and perpetuating the sporting way of life in the United States. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.